Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the DIAS Day Lecture. My name is Eucharia Meehan. I'm the Registrar and CEO of DIAS. The Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, or DIAS as it's commonly known, is an independent research organisation conducting advanced studies in a range of different areas, including looking at our Celtic heritage through Celtic studies, studying our island through geophysics, studying our planet and the universe through astrophysics, and then examining the theoretical and mathematical nature of everything through our theoretical physics division. The DIAS Day Lecture is a new initiative. This is in fact our second lecture. The initiative was instigated as part of our 80th anniversary celebrations. We will be 81 years old tomorrow. I'm delighted that we have for our DIAS Day lecture, our second DIAS Day lecture, Professor Terry Hughes, and your host for the lecture this afternoon, Elaine Burke, will introduce him shortly. But I just want to, before we start, thank him very much for taking the time to be with us. And indeed, he is joining us from across the globe, which you will hear more about that momentarily. Just before we begin, I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank Alice PR, who are working with us on this event. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to your host for the lecture. And our host this afternoon, and thanks Elaine for taking the time to be with us, is Elaine Burke, who is the editor of Silicon Republic, who also has a very strong track record as a journalist. Silicon Republic is, I suppose, a leading European science and technology outlet that covers, in effect, all things science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Elaine will be the host and will introduce the speaker and then actually moderate the questions at the end. So thank you again, Elaine, for taking the time to be with us, and hope you all enjoy the lecture.
Thanks, Eucharia, and welcome to all the participants to today's DIAS Day lecture. I'm delighted to be invited to take part. And as Eucharia said, you'll be hearing from me again later when we're going to do a Q&A with our guest lecturer, who is Professor Terry Hughes. And Terry is joining us from New South Wales, where he is a distinguished professor at the College of Science and Engineering in James Cook University. He was a recipient of the Maddox Prize in 2018, and his research focuses on the linkages between the ecology of reefs and their importance for societies and economies. So share your questions that you might have during the lecture from Terry in the chat, and we'll use them in the Q&A later, or if you have some that pop up during the Q&A, put them in the chat and we'll get to them. And thank you so much, and I'll pass you on out to Terry.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Good evening, everyone. I'll say good evening because it's 10:05 at night here. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to give this afternoon's lecture. You can see the title of my talk there. I won't read it out. I'm going to try a small experiment with you tonight. I've included in my talk 4 or 5 of my tweets, and I think after more than a year of COVID, we're all pretty fed up with Zoom talks with talking heads. So my attempt is to convey some of the human side of being a coral reef scientist and a climate change scientist, and also to try and convey to you the issue of scientists and communication and using social media like Twitter to get our science across to a broader audience. What we have to say as scientists is, I think, important, and it needs to be an important contribution to social discourse. We need to do a better job than most of us currently do at communication. So this is one of several tweets that I've added in. It says I have a lot of friends who can relate to this. So I'm the disaster scientist at the beginning of the movie. Coral reefs are, of course, renowned for their beauty and their biodiversity. This is a picture of a very healthy coral reef. It's got lots of corals and fish. In fact, one of the metrics of the condition of a coral reef is the amount of cover occupied by corals. In this picture here, about 80 or 90% of the substrate is occupied by corals. We call that coral cover. And this is obviously a very healthy coral reef, but unfortunately, many reefs around the world, probably the majority, are now quite degraded, where we have coral cover of closer to 10%, sometimes even less than 5%. Coral reefs are incredibly important, not just as beautiful destinations for an adventurous holiday, but for the people who live by them. Coral reefs are incredibly important for their livelihoods and for the food security that they provide to many hundreds of millions of people in tropical countries. But reefs almost everywhere are in decline, and the three main drivers of that decline are overfishing and pollution, particularly where there are lots of people. But even in more remote places that are not affected by local pollution and overfishing, even those more remote places are increasingly being impacted by global warming. And here's my second tweet. That skinny young gentleman at the bottom of your picture is me, believe it or not, 44 years ago in 1976. And the tweet is got a nostalgic note to it, saying that if you look at my recent papers in the last year or so, the titles reflect the global decline of coral reefs that have happened basically in the course of one scientist's career. I was a second-year undergraduate at Trinity College in Dublin when that photograph was taken. And little did I imagine that over the next 4 decades or so that globally reefs would really be in decline. When I was a student, we had never heard of the phenomenon called coral bleaching, certainly not at any regional or global scale. We knew that if you took a coral into the laboratory and tortured it in various ways, if you made it too hot or too cold or added sediment or some sort of pollution to the water, then the coral would get stressed and bleach. Bleaching occurs when the coral turns white because the colorful microscopic algae that live inside its tissue die, leaving the coral colorless. So the whiteness is actually the skeleton of the coral that you can see once the algae die back. As bleached coral is a sick coral, and if bleaching is severe, they can die. I'm going to show you a couple of before and after pictures. This is Jamaica when I first started to study there. And this is the same exact location more recently. Here's another example from Australia. This is a coastal reef. Look at the mountains in the background. The mountains are still there, but the fringing coastal reef has disappeared due to pollution. So I'm not going to talk about pollution and overfishing much this evening. Instead, I'm going to focus on climate change, which has emerged in recent decades as the #1 driver of the decline of coral reefs around the world. Climate change has several different elements. There are 4 listed here that affect climate change. I'm going to deal this evening with the first one, which is temperature rise and as a trigger for coral bleaching. The other 3 elements, severe weather events, sea level rise and ocean acidification, are so far at least not as important elements of climate change on reefs. Ocean acidification will become important in future decades as atmospheric CO2 concentrations continue to rise, and more of that CO2 ends up in the ocean, changing the pH and water chemistry of the oceans. But that's a longer term trend, and we know from studying the impacts of global warming on coral reefs that most of the world's coral reefs will cook long before pH becomes a problem in future decades if we don't do something about rising greenhouse gas emissions. This is a little movie clip which shows you the phenomenon of coral bleaching. So that's me in a low-flying airplane, about 150 meters up in the air, flying over the Great Barrier Reef. These are the flight paths that we took, which I'll explain in more detail in a moment. And this is what you see if you look at the window of a low-flying plane or a helicopter during a bleaching event. So everything that's yellow or white here is a bleached coral. This is very severe bleaching. When bleaching is as bad as this, most of those corals will die. And so we've seen up to 90% of the corals die during a severe bleaching event. This is what bleaching looks like underwater. This is footage taken in the northern part of the Great Barrier Reef in 2016. That greenish coral on the left there has already died from bleaching, and it's been colonized by seaweed. You can also see some corals that are less severely bleached. So there is a spectrum of susceptibilities to bleaching. We talk about corals that are winners versus losers. Bleaching is actually very selective when it happens. Some corals are more susceptible to bleaching and some are more susceptible to dying afterwards. So the outline of my talk is shown here. I'm going to start by talking about heat exposure and its relationship to bleaching. Then I'll talk about recent events. And then I'll get to the third point. Finally, I'll talk about the prospects for recovery. I can't actually read the two middle bullet points because I've got a "this meeting is being recorded" message in the middle of it, but I'll work around that. This is a map of the world with 100 colored points on it, and 70 of those points are red, which indicates that in a bleaching event in 2015 and 16, about 50% of the world's coral reefs turned red. They were severely bleached, where bleaching affected more than 30% of the corals. That bleaching event was a global event. It was the third such global event we've seen. The first was in 1998, which was then the warmest year on record. We saw the second one in 2010, and now we've seen a third one. So if we look at the history of bleaching at these 100 locations, on average, they've now bleached 3 or 4 times. Only 4% have never bleached. And increasingly, we're seeing the gap between one bleaching event and the next bleaching event shrink. And that's important because that gap is the window of opportunity for recovery. In the 1980s, the average gap between one bleaching event and the next was about 18 years. Since 2010, the average gap between one bleaching event and the next has shrunk to only 6 years. It takes about a decade for fast-growing corals to fully recover after a severe bleaching event. So we're really worried about that shrinking gap between one event and the next, and I'll have more to say about that. Bleaching has now become so common that we actually have weather forecasts that predict it. So organizations like NOAA in the United States produce these predictive maps that are forecasts for bleaching. This is a forecast issued by NOAA on the 14th of February 2017. So February, March is the Southern Hemisphere summer. So you'll see that most of the areas that are colored red in this map are from the equator further south. In July, August, those red colors would move into the Northern Hemisphere where, of course, the northern summer occurs. So there's a 6-month lag between bleaching that occurs in the two hemispheres. NOAA uses a metric called degree heating weeks as a way of measuring the exposure of corals to heat. So degree heating weeks has 2 components: the time, so the duration of heat exposure in weeks, and the temperature spike measured in centigrade. So the spike is the degrees centigrade in elevated temperature above the long-standing summer maximum. So 8-degree heating weeks means that a location has been exposed by, say, 2 degrees above the long-term summer maximum for 4 weeks. So 4 times 2 equals 8. Or it could be 1 degree above the long-term summer maximum that lasts for 8 weeks. So it integrates both the time and the duration. It's simply a metric of heat stress exposure. And 4-degree heating weeks is, as a rule of thumb, enough to trigger bleaching, and 8-degree heating weeks triggers coral mortality. The corals start to die at roughly 8-degree heating weeks. So climate modeling of the future bleaching frequency of coral reefs as global warming continues is based on those thresholds, with the assumption that those thresholds will continue to be accurate in decades coming. The Great Barrier Reef has now bleached 5 times. The first recorded bleaching event was in 1998, the hottest year then on record, except 2002 was hotter again on the Great Barrier Reef, except 2016 was hotter again. And then we had the first instance of back-to-back bleaching in 2 consecutive summers. So the gap between 2016 and 17 was 1 year. And then in 2020, we had the 5th event. So we've had now 3 bleaching events in just a 5-year period of 2016, 2017, and 2020. February 2020 was the hottest month for sea surface temperatures on the Great Barrier Reef in over a century of records. So the heating continues, the bleaching is escalating, it's becoming more severe. I'll show you that in a moment. And the gap between one event and the next one is shrinking, and that's very concerning. So one of the most basic research questions you can ask when a bleaching event occurs is, where is it occurring and how severe is it? And then you can move on to more interesting questions like, why is it more severe where it is, and what are the consequences of varying degrees of heat exposure, which I mentioned is usually measured using the degree heating week metric. These are the flight paths that we flew in 2016. So first point I want to make is about the size of the Great Barrier Reef. From north to south, it's 2,300 kilometers long, and it's up to 250 kilometers wide. So in a small plane, it takes about 8 days of flying to crisscross the length and breadth of the reef. So the purpose of those red squiggles, it looks like the pilot has had one gin and tonic too many, is to crisscross the reef and intercept as many reefs as possible. The Great Barrier Reef has about 3,000 individual reefs, and our sample size, our survey sample in 2016 was 1,056. So we flew over roughly 1/3 of the reefs, and that's certainly a big enough sample size to produce maps of where the bleaching is occurring, which I'll show you in just a moment. Here's another tweet. This is a tweet that we put out in April 2016. So only about 2 weeks after we finished our flights, we had preliminary results that we could issue to the public as a fairly crude map that shows red in the north, orange in the middle, and green in the south. So green means little or no bleaching. Red means very severe bleaching. I'm not going to go through the numbers that are on here. And the central region was intermediate, which we've colored here, orange. That red region is roughly twice the length of the distance between Donegal and Wexford. So just to give you an idea of scale, it's about 750 kilometers or so in length from the border between Australia and Papua New Guinea in the north down to the city of Cairns at the intercept between the red and the orange zone. One of the frustrations of this research is that, as many of you will know, it takes about a full year to collect data, analyze it, write it up for journals, submit it, deal with the reviews, and finally the paper is published. But there was huge interest in this bleaching event as it unfolded. And so as a group of scientists, we had to develop better ways and quicker ways of communicating with the general public, and this tweet was one of them. And here's the actual journal article which was published. So after the 2016 event, the third, we were able to compare the three events that had happened on the Great Barrier Reef up to that time. So the top three maps show the bleaching pattern from our aerial surveys. So in 2016, the northern Great Barrier Reef was very severely bleached, the middle less so, and the south escaped bleaching. And you can see from the bottom three maps, these are from NOAA's satellite data of temperature, which give us the degree heating week metric. You can see which parts of the reef were hot in red, and which parts were intermediate in yellow and orange, and which parts were cool. So the south in 2016 was cool. It was cool because of a cyclone. So when I was a student, we used to worry about cyclones because they're quite destructive of corals. They smash them up because of the big waves. But in 2016, an ex-cyclone, Cyclone Winston, which passed over Fiji in late February, came in early March to the southern Great Barrier Reef as a rain depression. It drew the temperature down by about 2 degrees centigrade because of the cloud cover, and it rescued the southern half of the Great Barrier Reef from severe bleaching. And if you think about that, it was the vagaries, the chance event of an ex-cyclone showing up with quite precise timing that stopped the entire Great Barrier Reef bleaching in 2016. And I'll talk about the amount of corals that died in the northern part of the Great Barrier Reef in a few moments. But if you compare the bottom maps here, which show the heat, with the top maps, which show the bleaching, you can see that there's a very close correlation. The cooler parts didn't bleach, the hotter parts certainly did. We can also look at that relationship between heat exposure and the amount of bleaching by measuring bleaching more precisely underwater. And this is what this graph shows. So in 2016, at the time of the bleaching event, we went to all of those reefs on the map underwater, and we measured bleaching as a continuous variable from 0 to 100%, which is shown here on the y-axis. And so each dot represents a different reef. And you can see the relationship here between the amount of bleaching that ranged from 0 at very low levels of heat exposure to much higher rates of 80 to 100% bleaching as the degree heating week exposure increased. So NOAA's forecasts are based on 4 degrees being a threshold for bleaching occurring. But in 2016, we actually found that the corals in the Great Barrier Reef were more sensitive than that. We saw significant bleaching at 2 and 3 degree heating weeks. And by the time we got to 4, we actually had about 45% bleaching occurring. So here's 4, and it corresponds with about 45% bleaching. That was a bit of a surprise. It took less heat than we thought, than NOAA's predictions would lead you to believe on the Great Barrier Reef in 2016. The next research question we were interested in is, well, what happens afterwards? If all the bleached corals simply regained their color as the temperature dropped going into the following winter, then bleaching wouldn't matter. And bleaching is such an innocuous term, it doesn't sound like it's terribly threatening. And bleaching, when it's mild, doesn't cause any mortality. But we saw very severe bleaching in 2016. So we were really interested to know how well these corals survived, who died, who survived. And the selectivity of bleaching is really important because that can change the mix of coral species. This photograph here shows a close-up of a reef where most of the corals died as a consequence of the heat exposure in 2016. Most of these corals are flat table-shaped corals, or some of them are tall branching staghorn corals, or these are bushy staghorn corals. In the background, you might see this mound-shaped coral. It's still alive. And here's another one back here. These are slower growing corals that are tougher. They live for up to several centuries, and they're generally better at dealing with heat exposure and bleaching events than these more susceptible table-shaped and branching corals. I'll talk about that a bit more in a few minutes. So the map on the left is our result for the mortality. We found in the south, where there was little bleaching and little heat exposure, that there was no mortality, but in the northern third of the Great Barrier Reef, we lost an average of 51% of the corals in just an 8 or 9 month period following the bleaching in 2016. The scale of that loss is huge. It's a much bigger footprint, the red area on the map on your left, than the damage that's caused by a typical cyclone. When a cyclone crosses the Great Barrier, it typically comes ashore, crossing perpendicular to the coast, more or less. And that creates a path of destruction that's typically 50 to 100 kilometers wide if it's a severe cyclone. But the path of destruction in red and the map on the left is about 700 kilometers wide. It's vastly bigger in area than the impact of even a Category 5 severe cyclone. The map on the right comes from NOAA satellites. It shows the degree heating week exposure, which again maps very tightly onto the pattern of mortality. It was cooler in the south, no mortality. It was very hot in the north, very high levels of bleaching and subsequent mortality. The next question we looked at is how selective was the bleaching? And this is a really important part of the story. If all corals were equally susceptible, then coral cover would go down, but the mix of species wouldn't change. But that's not the case. The picture on the left shows a susceptible group of corals, the branching staghorn corals, that are often very visible and dominant on Indo-Pacific coral reefs, like the Great Barrier Reef. And this is basically a dead stand reduced to rubble by heat stress with no sign of recovery afterwards. So these branching and tabular corals are the so-called losers. They're heat susceptible and they have high levels of mortality. On the right, in contrast, are these slow-growing, long-lived corals that are tougher. They're also resistant to cyclones as well as to heat stress. So we're already seeing on the Great Barrier Reef a really rapid and radical shift in the mix of coral species. And that's important because different corals have different ecological functions. They do different things. In particular, these three-dimensional branching staghorn corals provide most of the nooks and crannies, most of the three-dimensionality on a coral reef. They're really important for all the rest of the biodiversity that depends on corals for the habitat that they create, the fish, the crustaceans, and so on. If you lose a lot of three-dimensional corals, it has a follow-on effect, a sort of domino effect on fish that depend on the habitat for shelter. Some fish rely on corals because it's part of their diet. And most fish rely on corals at the juvenile phase because coral habitat is the nursery habitat for most species of fish that live on coral reefs. So there are very broad-ranging ecological impacts from this loss of corals and the shift in the mix of corals that survive. Then in 2017, the bleaching happened again. This is the first time we've seen back-to-back bleaching in 2 consecutive years. It's predicted by the climate modelers that we could see back-to-back bleaching every consecutive years by mid-century, depending on the trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions and how much more warming the world sees in coming decades. One of the questions we were interested in is how these two events interacted. You can see in 2016, most of the heat and most of the bleaching was in the northern third of the Great Barrier Reef. In 2017, most of the heat was in the middle region. And so we saw more severe bleaching in the central region in year 2 than in year 1. The south escaped in both of these events because it was cooler, and the north bleached in 2016, but not in 2017. So what we did next is we asked this question: is there a sort of ecological memory effect of the history of year 1 on the subsequent bleaching event in year 2, one year later? So we looked first at where the heat was in those 2 different years. So this is another map of the Great Barrier Reef that shows the difference in degree heating week, so delta heat between year 1 and year 2. So everywhere on this map that's yellow, orange, or red was hotter in year 2 than in year 1. Only this small inshore region in the far north was cooler in 2017 compared to 2016. Despite 2017 being hotter, we actually saw less bleaching that year compared to the year previous in 2016, with the exception of the central region, which was the hottest. So this graph on the left shows that it took a lot more heat in year 2 in 2017 to produce the same level of bleaching produced by a given level of heating 1 year earlier in 2016. In other words, this pink curve moved way to the right. So the graph shows the probability of severe bleaching occurring for a given level of degree heating week exposure. The flattened curve in blue and a shift to the right means it took a lot more heat in year 2 to produce the same level of bleaching as year 1. We were very surprised by this. One of the assumptions of climate models is that the threshold for bleaching and for mortality of corals doesn't change through time, that the corals will respond the same way in 2040, 2030 as they did in 2020 or 2016. We now know that that's not the case. These so-called bleaching response curves are much more flexible than we thought they were. And there's a variety of mechanisms that could have caused this shift. And the simplest one, we think, is probably the most likely one, and that is the shift in the mix of species because of the huge loss of corals in the northern Great Barrier Reef in 2016, meant that when heat stress, heat exposure occurred again 1 year later, we were dealing with a tougher assemblage of corals. The more susceptible ones had already bleached and died in 2016. And even within the species, we would expect that the tougher genotypes are also prevailing in subsequent years following more than one bleaching event. So the implication of this result is that we no longer have the luxury of studying these bleaching events as one-offs, as single events. We really need to understand the dynamics of chains of events and how they interact with each other, because they're not simply additive, they're actually interacting with each other, and the gap between one event and the next one is really important. If the gap isn't long enough, then we would expect that this memory effect would eventually fade as the corals recover from a distant bleaching event. But as those gaps get smaller and smaller, we would expect this kind of interaction to become more and more important, more and more prevalent into the future. So to summarize all of that, the impact of the second heat wave in 2017 and its geography, it was more severe in the central part of the Great Barrier Reef, but didn't reoccur in the north, was contingent on the history of the first event in 2017. And so we need to understand these not just as single events, but as multiple events, and that means the climate modelers have some work to take account of these kinds of interactions, which aren't currently part of their models, which assume fixed thresholds like NOAA's 4-degree heating week or 8-degree heating week. There are some models that look at the potential for adaptation by corals, whereby it would take not 8-degree heating weeks, but maybe 9, maybe 10 as we move forward. But they don't allow for the bleaching thresholds to move backwards and forwards as a function of history and the gap between one event and the next one in a chain of events. So the dynamics that we've discovered is a lot more complicated and will be much more challenging to model successfully and accurately the longer term impacts of bleaching. But they do suggest that because it took more heat in 2017 to cause the same level of bleaching, that some of the more dire predictions of losing 99% of coral reefs with 2 degrees of global warming are perhaps overstated. We are seeing more and more evidence for these interactions between one event and the next, and we're seeing a shift in the mix of corals and the mix of genotypes as coral reefs toughen up, to some extent at least, to these recurrent bleaching events. Having said that, we lost about 31% of the corals on the Great Barrier Reef in 2016, and somewhere under 20% more in 2017. So recurrent bleaching events is not good news. The point I'm making, though, is that the severity of the second bleaching event was not as bad as the first because of the shift that occurred as a function of this history and contingency of multiple events. Here's my third tweet. This was from March 2020, when the Great Barrier Reef bleached for a 5th time. And I'll show you some maps of that now. So we now have 5 maps of bleaching and 5 maps of degree heating week exposure, which are shown along the bottom. If you look at each pair of maps, the heat matches the bleaching, or if you like, the coolness matches the non-bleaching. And if we look at the last 3 events, which occurred over a period of only 5 years, first the north, then the center, and more recently, mostly the south, were severely bleached. So after these 3 events in just 5 years, about 80% of the individual reefs comprising the Great Barrier Reef have now bleached severely since 2016. And if we include the milder levels of bleaching in yellow and orange on these maps, 98% of the Great Barrier Reef has now experienced some level of bleaching in just the last 5 years. So this is really a game changer in terms of the dynamics of the reef. We're seeing really rapid changes. We've lost about half of the coral cover. The mix of coral species is already changing, and it will continue to change. And that's where much of our research is focused on next. So I've talked about these 3 points. I'm going to move on now and talk about what's going to happen next, we think, on the Great Barrier Reef and the prospects for recovery. Coral recovery of depleted populations is initiated by the settlement of coral larvae on a reef. So the corals breed, they release larvae, those larvae disperse to varying extents depending on the species, and then they settle on the reef, become baby corals, which grow up. So recruitment is the term we use for those processes, and it's the way in which a coral population is replenished. When corals reproduce, they can do so in one of 2 ways. They can brood well-developed larvae. About 10% of species do that. Those larvae are big when they're released and they don't go very far. They typically settle on the same reef as they were produced on. whereas spawning corals release eggs and sperm, which are fertilized in the water column. They're less developed. They take about another week before they're ready to settle on a reef, and they can disperse typically many tens, but probably not many hundreds of kilometers of reefs. So they go from one reef to the next. They represent the main way in which reefs can connect to each other and rescue each other after a major disturbance like a cyclone or a bleaching event. We've done many of these deployments of recruitment panels. These are artificial substrates that we put out onto the reef at the time of spawning. We collect them a few weeks later, look at them under a microscope and count the number of baby corals. It's an efficient way of using a standardized substrate to measure the replenishment capacity of the corals. And we've done it multiple times over many decades prior to the bleaching in 2016 and 17, and we've since done it afterwards. And this is the main result. So the size of these bubbles represent the number of corals that we counted on our artificial settlement panels. The yellow represents spawning species and the blue represent brooders. So 2 points after the 2016 bleaching, the size of the bubbles is greatly diminished. It's diminished by more than 80%. And the proportion of brooders and spawners shifted in favor of brooders. So not only do we see a shift in the mix of the adults who survived and who didn't, the losers and the winners after the bleaching, we're also seeing a shift in the mix of baby corals, and that will drive further changes in the mix of adults that these baby corals grow into in coming years and decades. So there's two sort of filters going on. One is on the way down when we have differential survivorship following a bleaching event, and the other is on the way up during the recovery phase when we have now a shift in the mix of baby corals with proportionately more brooders in blue here than before the bleaching event occurred. So the whole dynamics of the Great Barrier Reef is changing. The brooders don't go very far compared to the spawners. So the way in which the Great Barrier Reef is interconnected, the way each reef talks to another one through the delivery of larvae has fundamentally changed as a consequence of these three bleaching events in just the last 5 years. How many corals have died and how many survive is really important. There's a lot of attention now occurring around the world on restoration projects. And while it's possible to rebuild coral populations artificially, it's incredibly expensive and it's not successful at very significant scales. So you could grow 1 hectare of coral if you were prepared to spend several $1 million. But you can't restore an area of the Great Barrier Reef. It would cost $2 to $3 trillion with current technologies, at least, to regrow that number of corals. You'd need about 250 million corals, adult-sized, to regrow 1% coral cover on an area the size of the Great Barrier Reef. It's 344,000 square kilometers in area. So here's the maths. There are about 50 corals the size of your thumb or larger on a typical square meter of healthy coral reef. That's 50 billion corals per 1,000 square kilometers. There are 25,000 square kilometers of coral reef habitat on the Great Barrier Reef. So the numbers are sort of eye-watering. But the good news is we've lost about half of them in the last 5 years. That still means the population of surviving corals, the tougher ones that made it through these 3 bleaching events, is many times larger than the human population of planet Earth. We're still dealing with significant survivors, and that trajectory that is already now underway will continue. And the challenge, I think, is not to regrow artificially small areas of reef, but to look after those survivors and to ensure that they can repopulate depleted coral reefs. This is a picture from French Polynesia showing a coral nursery, and tragically, most of those corals are dying because they bleached. So the number one action before any restoration can be attempted on a coral reef or anywhere else is you have to deal with the causes, the root causes of the decline before you can hope to rebuild the coral populations. And here's another tweet, which makes the point that prevention is better than cure. I'm often asked this question, will we still have coral reefs in the future? And my answer is a cautious yes, but they'll be quite different. We're already seeing that trajectory. And where coral reefs end up in future decades will depend entirely on the trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions and the trajectory of rising temperatures. We've seen the impact already of just over 1.1, 1.2 degrees of global average warming. I think 1.5 is doable. 2 will be really tough. And if we go above that, then coral reefs will become increasingly less recognizable in future decades. So it comes down to this trajectory. And this comes from the IPCC report released at the end of 2018. So the part on the left is the trajectory of emissions overwhelmingly from fossil fuels, coal, oil, and methane on the left. It peaks here in 2016, but of course that peak has continued. And the challenging part of this graph is the downward trajectory, which needs to be steeper than the historical upward trajectory in emissions. But this is the pathway that will save coral reefs. And where we end up will depend on the slope of that downward trajectory and the speed with which we can reach zero emissions. And even that won't be enough to keep under 1.5 degrees of warming. We've actually got to produce net negative emissions for a period to keep a safe place for coral reefs. And the only way we know how to do that at the moment is to plant trees and lots of them. So in conclusion, recurrent bleaching is the new normal. Coral reefs are already responding, but hundreds of billions of corals still survive. And I've talked about the trajectory of the shift in the mix of coral species, which will continue. Restoration, yes, you can do it at very small scales, but it costs a fortune. It's not going to get us out of trouble. We actually have to deal with the causes. That's local drivers like pollution and overfishing, but also reducing emissions. That's really the key to saving coral reefs in the future. And I've often come across people who refer to coral reefs as the canary in the coal mine, the implication being that coral reefs are more susceptible than other ecosystems, that they're sort of the harbinger of what tougher ecosystems will have to go through after coral reefs have disappeared. I'm not sure any of that is true, because we're also seeing the same sorts of impacts on terrestrial ecosystems and in other marine systems, kelp beds, seagrass beds, mangrove systems around the world. It's not just reefs. I think reefs are the poster child rather than the canary in the coal mine. And so we have to be worried about all these other ecosystems. It's not just coral reefs. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Terry. That was really, really interesting. And I have to say, I really appreciate the personal capacity you brought to it through some of the tone of your tweets, because it's not the pretty picture of corals we usually have in our minds. It is quite bleak. And I wonder, is that very tough for you to deal with? Because I mean, you've been years monitoring these trends, and action to counter them has not been as quick as it might have been, or you might have liked. And I was just wondering how that impacts you personally.
Yeah, well, the first tweet I had there was the one that displays the frustration, I guess, of being ignored. So climate scientists and people who study the impacts of climate on ecosystems and indeed the impacts of climate on people are all frustrated by the lack of global action on greenhouse gas emissions. So those emissions continue to rise. I think public awareness is increasing. We're seeing social movements like the school children strike, and you know, I think global awareness is at an all-time high. There's been some political progress in certainly in the United States. Australia is being dragged kicking and screaming to the negotiation table. Australia tragically still supports more fossil fuel development. Our Prime Minister is talking about a fossil fuel driven COVID recovery, even though Australia has vast resources in renewable energy, solar energy and wind. We're seeing some progress, but it really does need to accelerate. We've got to reduce carbon emissions faster than they've risen in recent decades, and that's a huge challenge. So I think scientists play an important role in communicating our science. There's not much point in just talking among ourselves about it, and increasingly more and more scientists are being vocal, are prepared to give public talks, to write blogs, talk to the media, meet with politicians. It's part of our job, really, as part of being a scientist. I can't hear you, Elaine.
Apologies there. I was just explaining to our participants, we're getting some questions through now, and if you want to pop your own questions into the chat, just click the chat button at the bottom and you can add your questions there. But just to go to one of the ones we received, asking about tourism to the Great Barrier Reef, because obviously it is this point that has been quite of interest to tourists, and how that might have contributed to the impacts that we're now seeing on the Great Barrier Reef. And do you have a view on that yourself?
It is actually a two-edged sword, I guess. People are obviously concerned about the emissions from flying 1 million people to Australia to view the Great Barrier Reef each year. That's the kind of numbers. Tourism is an important industry in Queensland, where I live. It employs, reef tourism employs about 65,000 people. It's a $5 or $6 billion per year industry. And that, I think, is politically important, because those jobs are the social and economic reason why the Great Barrier Reef should be better protected. So I feel that tourism actually has a net benefit for the Great Barrier Reef. There are more jobs in tourism in Queensland than there are in coal mining. Ironically, the Great Barrier Reef is used to ship huge amounts of coal and fossil gas from Australia to markets overseas. Those markets have probably peaked and will hopefully shrink rapidly in coming decades. So really the government, I think, should be focusing on sustainable jobs produced by the reef rather than unsustainable jobs in fossil fuels.
Sorry, I keep muting myself so that I don't interrupt your speaking, but that's a really great answer, a great question as well. So we have another one from our participants, and it's kind of about your choice, going back to that picture of that young man that you showed us and the decision he made to study coral reefs while at Trinity College Dublin, which does seem an unusual place to start studying coral reefs, whereas you're in the ideal place now where you are. What drove that decision originally?
Well, I studied zoology at Trinity College. And I was a diver from a relatively young age. My father was a diver in the 1960s. So he taught me to dive when I was a teenager. And I had an opportunity in that second tweet I showed you, where I was driving the boat, to work for a summer at a marine lab in the Caribbean. And I quickly realized that the water was a lot warmer. And If you wanted to be a marine biologist working underwater for 4 or 5 hours a day, the tropics was the place to be. And coral reefs are really fascinating. It's been a huge privilege to be able to do research on them for my whole career. It's very challenging to figure out how something as complex as that works. So it's been a lifetime of asking interesting research questions. The irony, of course, is that everything we thought we knew about how coral reefs work is now wrong, because they've changed so much in the recent years. The mix of species is different. The way they repair themselves and are interconnected is different. We have to relearn how coral reefs are working in a changing planet. So the next generation of coral reef scientists, my students and younger colleagues, really have their work cut out for them to follow this trajectory and understand it and predict its future. There's a lot of work to be done. So certainly the message isn't reefs are doomed. We might as well go study some hardier ecosystem as a bunch of researchers. There's a lot of work to be done to understand these newly evolving systems and to do as best we can to protect them into the future, recognizing that the reefs of yesterday tragically are gone. We need to focus on the reefs of tomorrow and securing a future for them. So the goal is not to preserve the coral reefs of the past, that we will fail if we attempt that path. We need to steer reefs into a safe place. We need to reduce emissions, obviously, and set the scene for the repair of reefs in incoming decades. So we talk about coral reefs running the climate gauntlet, meaning there's potentially light at the end of this long tunnel. We need to steer towards that light. What we need is for global emissions to drop to zero, for temperatures to stabilize at a level which is safe for coral reefs. So there's no time to lose to achieve that.
Thanks very much, Terry. And I'm just going to fit in one more question now before we wrap up. And it's about what you showed us about researching the reefs using aircraft and the long length of travel that you have to take crisscrossing the reefs. So this person wants to know what's the potential perhaps for satellite-based observation and measurement of the reefs?
Yeah, that's a very active area of research. It's obviously time consuming to get into a plane for 7 or 8 days of flying. It's certainly physically and mentally exhausting, particularly on days where you fly over maybe 250 really severely damaged reefs. People are trialing other technologies at the smaller end of the scale. People are using drones, but drones, you'd need hundreds of them to cover 3,000 reefs over a period of a week or two, which is the window you have during a bleaching event to measure the extent of bleaching from the air. Satellites don't quite have this resolution. The pixels are too big. You don't get the same kind of information that you get looking at the window of a small plane. So it's pretty old-fashioned technology. We purposely mimicked the way that the bleaching data was collected for the first 2 bleaching events in 1998 and 2002, when a small plane was used for the first time. We then had a 14-year gap. So when I decided to redo it in the 3rd event in 2016, and again in 17 and 20, we used the same methodology so we could produce maps that were comparable to look at all 5 events.
And I think we actually have one last question, if you have time, Terry, to hang on
Sure.
for a little bit. Yeah. So we often hear about new medicines being found in tropical forests. Could the same possibly be an argument for coral preservation?
Well, I think we need to think more beyond just the corals to the broader ecosystem. So some types of marine organisms are more interesting chemically in terms of discovering pharmaceuticals than others. Corals are not particularly interesting because they're well defended by their skeletons. So most chemicals in animals are anti-predator poisons or deterrents. Corals are well defended by their spiky skeletons, so they're not particularly interesting chemically. Soft corals, which lack the skeleton of hard corals, are a lot more toxic. And so are sponges and things like sea squirts, ascidians. I think that's where the interesting chemistry has been done. So yes, chemicals from coral reefs is another argument for preserving them. And obviously it's important for the pharmaceutical and chemical industries. I think probably more important than that, though, is the local benefits that coral reefs provide to mainly poor people, mainly in small, rapidly developing countries, where coral reefs provide livelihoods from reef tourism and, of course, food security from reef fisheries. So there's lots of reasons why we should preserve coral reefs. Pharmaceuticals is on the list.
So I'm afraid we'll have to end the Q&A there so that we can let people get back to their business after the lunchtime lecture. And thank you so much, Terry, for sharing your passion for this project and also the flicker of optimism that's there as well. And thank you to DIAS for hosting this and for inviting me to be taking part in it, for all the participants for joining us, and to Alice PR and Events for helping to organize everything and field the questions from everyone. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks very much. Good night.